Welcome to another Red Dice Diaries video, and this is the first video I've made since hitting 100 subscribers on the Red Dice Diaries YouTube channel. So thank you very much to all the people who watch my videos, especially the people who have clicked on subscribe down below. And thanks very much to the people who've commented on my videos, and especially the members of the YouTube RPG Brigade who've encouraged me to make more videos. Thank you very much. But now, on with the mainstay of the video, which is my review of this Legends of Anglerre, a fantasy book for the Fate setting. Now, I've been reading this for quite some time, and as most of you know, I'm an unashamed fan of the Fate RPG by Evil Hat Productions. Now, looking at the little logo there for Fate, I can tell that this is a version of the game before the latest version of the Fate core rules was released, and therefore may contain some elements that were either renamed or that were not kept hold of in the latest edition of the games. However, let me assure you, there is nothing in this book that you could not easily adapt to use with the current rules with minimal effort that certainly wouldn't be beyond most people. Okay, so let's talk about the layout of the book first of all. Now, this is a solid hardback book with a nice bit of art on the front cover, fantasy art showing 3 characters and this sort of prehistoric looking dragon in the background. It's fairly standard fantasy stuff, but it's always nice to see a dragon that looks a little bit different, and I really like the sort of swords and sorcery feel of this illustration, since prehistoric beasts were a common occurrence in that sort of genre. Now, the layout inside the book is a fairly no-nonsense, clearly laid out black and white 2-column standard with numerous panels from the Starblazer comic used to illustrate. Now, these will have a certain old school appeal if you're a fan of this 70s 80s era of comics like myself, and as well as that, you also have a nice map on both the inside front cover and a couple on the inside back cover for the 2 sample settings, the Hinterlands and the Anglerre setting, that are featured in this book. Okay, so I'm going to go through a brief chapter breakdown now to let you know what is in this crammed book, and there's an awful lot in there, so I'm going to whip through it fairly quickly. Okay, we've got chapter 1, Introduction, which talks about the British 70s and 80s Starblazer comics that this takes inspiration from, and as I've said, a lot of the internal art is from those comics. It talks a little bit about what the Fate system is, although as I said, this is a version prior to the most recent release of Fate Core. And there's the standard what is an RPG chapter material in there, which won't be needed for most people who already play RPGs, but it's useful for beginners, although I'm not sure how much a beginner would pick up this giant-sized book, which has quite a large number of pages in. Let's just see. It's certainly got at least, well, about 400 pages in. I'm not sure whether a newcomer to the hobby would go for such a large book, but the what is an RPG chapter is fairly standard for all role-playing games. It also talks about some of the differences between Anglerre and its sister game, Starblazer Adventures, which is a Fate science fiction space opera setting that I've only just started to read myself, so the differences didn't really mean much to me, but I can see how it'd be nice to have in there for people who are familiar with the other game, and no doubt they're hopefully hoping to bring some of those into this new audience, so fair play to them. Okay, chapters 2 to 11 are the main meat of the game's rules. These cover how to create characters in a similar way to Fate Core, although there are some concepts, as I said, such as tagging aspects, which have either been renamed or disposed of in the most recent release. There's some nice advice given here for running games with different power levels, and checking my notes, I can see that the game rates it as good, great, and superb characters. This is quite useful advice, and it allows you to run any sort of game you want. The game splits character gen into a number of different phases. For instance, starting off with your training and your very first adventure, the first tale which features your character, and then you go on to guest star in the tales of other people. And I think this is a great idea, since it immediately creates that bond between the player party and gives you a good pushing off point for your game. And you don't have to do that awkward, oh, you all meet in a tavern scene at the start. There's already a solid bedrock of this relationship there from the get-go. One very interesting idea that I liked is the concept of future aspects, and this is the first time I've come across this. It's an idea where a player picks a goal for their character and assigns it a number of plot points. The game recommends 3. Each plot point counts as a milestone, and you receive skill points to advance your character when you achieve one of these milestones. And I think that's a great idea for giving characters more concrete goals. Chapter 4 covers fantasy races, which the game represents via a combination of aspects and stunts that can be taken to give your character a certain flavour, whether it's an elf, a dwarf, whatever. All of the races suggested have a very familiar feel to them for anyone who's played fantasy before or watched a fantasy film. And there are some nice unusual races as well, such as fawns and dragons, which are quite tastefully done and based on monster races featured in the later bestiary. Chapter 5 provides a list of occupation style aspects, I suppose you'd call them. And the idea of these is that you take an occupation aspect and this unlocks various stunts and abilities that you can buy. And they all cover various standard fantasy tropes such as the ranger, the fighter, the archer, the wizard, etc. The stunts are all written very well, and I can see GMs getting a lot of use from them beyond just using them in an Anglerre game. I know that I'm certainly going to be piking some of them for use in my future fantasy game. There's a nice little bit about using occupations to represent unusual life-changing circumstances, amongst other things such as becoming undead, and creating a specific list of applicable stunts and aspects for that. Now, I think this is a brilliant idea because, again, it's adding more options in there for your game, more potential avenues of interest for your player characters, and you can't have too many options at the end of the day. Chapter 6 is the obligatory equipment list, and it's fairly standard, but it does have some interesting suggestions for weapon aspects. These are aspects that you can use whenever you're wielding or using a certain piece of weaponry or equipment. And leads us nicely on into Chapter 7, which discusses aspects in more detail. And for those who don't know, aspects are simply story elements that allow you to spend fate points to boost your rolls or re-roll them entirely. And they also allow you to gain fate points when your aspect is invoked, either by yourself, another player, or by the GM, to add additional plots and complications to your life. So, for instance, you may have an aspect that says, leader of a barbarian kingdom. Now, you would expect the leader of a barbarian kingdom to be very strong and very good at fighting after fighting off numerous challenges to his leadership. Therefore, you could spend a fate point to invoke this aspect whenever you're in a combat situation or one where the situation favours the strong, and you could gain a +2 or a reroll of your dice. However, there are also complications that go with this. So, for instance, someone could offer you a fate point to say that you have been challenged by a member of your tribe for leadership. Now, you would have to either pay a fate point to avoid that and say, no, don't fancy that at all, or you could accept the fate point and that scene would play out as it is. And this is a great way of generating plots within games. And it also makes it very easy for the GM to draw on plot elements that interest the players, since presumably if you've put it down as an aspect, you're at least slightly interested in it, otherwise why have you chosen it? Okay, looking at my notes, I can see that Chapter 8 covers skills and stunts. It's very much standard fare for anyone who's played a Fate game, but does go into a lot of details about what you can accomplish with each of these skills, and there's some fairly well written and interesting stunts in there that, again, I think have got a lot of potential for use outside the Anglerre game. Chapter 9 deals with magic and supernatural powers. These are represented as a combination of aspects, so you might take an aspect of trainee in the Red College of Magic to give you an in to having supernatural powers, and the actual powers themselves will be brought as a combination of specific power skills that you would roll to accomplish certain effects, and perhaps even stunts that would go with that power skill. Now, I think this is a great way of representing powers. Since it's very uncomplicated for the player, they recognise it as simply another skill they have to roll, and it can cover various types of effect. In the game book, These go from alchemy all the way through many different things, summoning, etc., up to weather effect. And I think this chapter is certainly one of the main points of interest in the game. And I would certainly recommend anyone thinking of coming up with a fantasy-based magic system in Fate or one of these spin-offs to certainly give this a look to get some ideas. Chapter 10 covers artifacts and magical items, which talks about numerous ways these items can be represented, including using the Fate Fractal or the Bronze Rule, I believe it is, to generate them as their own characters with their own aspects and skills. And Chapter 11 is a brief 2-page explanation of fate points and how they work, which is quite short and to the point, but extremely well written and doesn't really require any more page count. Chapter 12 focuses on how to do things within the game, and this covers all of the various rules, skill rolls, consequences, recovering from damage, etc. Also, there's a little bit extra about minions and allies and how they can be used, and there's some more information about using power stunts and skills. And a couple of interesting paragraphs about the potential cost of magic and how you could use aspects to represent weaknesses that have been acquired through your study of the arcane. This is particularly interesting to me and is probably something I'm going to use in a future game. Chapter 13 is titled Creatures Great and Small, and it's a discussion of non-human monsters, particularly those of a larger size category or a smaller size category than the players. And it gives you a ream of specific stunts for different size creatures. The rules in this book are quite interesting, and they posit the idea that no creature may attack or meaningfully interact with any other creature that is beyond 2 size steps, either bigger or smaller than itself. Now, there are certain stunts that break these rules, but I do like the simplicity and the abstraction that this offers. It doesn't get too complicated. And there's some great advice about how players can take on much larger creatures than themselves, including taking them on a piece at a time, using scenery against them, breaking it down to a more level playing field. This is extremely well written and very interesting stuff. And even if you don't use it as a whole, the advice in here will certainly be useful if you're the sort of GM who likes to spring monstrously huge foes on your player characters. And let's face it, who doesn't from time to time? Okay, chapter 14 and 15 deal with gods, guilds and empires, sailing ships and war machines. Now, this is similar to the previous chapter, but it talks about how organizations, constructs, guilds, etc. can all be represented as characters in their own right, and it gives you an entire subsystem for dealing with these different aspects of the game, which is effectively giving them a different set of skills and stunts that can be used. Now, this is one way of dealing with it, but I'm not sure if this level of complexity is needed, to be perfectly honest. And the construct system, to give one example, seems extremely detailed, far more detailed a treatment than I'd personally care to give to constructs, war machines, trebuchets, etc. But for anyone who likes that sort of thing, you've got it in there as an option, and I'm always in favour of giving people more options, whatever works for your game at the end of the day. Chapter 16 and 17 are the Fog of War and Templates chapters, and this gives a very, very detailed subsystem for units and mass combat, which again has the up and down sides of the constructs chapter. And the template chapter is just basically a big list of sample units, war machines, organizations, guilds, etc., which may be useful if you decide to use those subsystems, and if you don't, at least the aspects in them may give you some interesting ideas. Chapters 18 and 19 are all about campaign creation and the setting, and there's some good suggestions for making more mythic games in here, and there's some great ideas on how you can create a campaign setting in collaboration with your players and really get them involved from the get-go, so drawing them in and immersing them in the game, which is obviously a good thing, and I would be very much in favour of this every day of the week. So I thoroughly recommend you give this chapter a go. And some great advice in there. Chapter 20 and 21 talk about plot, stress and treasure. Chapter 20 is a brief section about how you can use the stress track, which you normally use to keep track of damage, whether physical or mental, on the player, but how you can also use it to track your plots. having a stress tracker with a number of spaces on it, and once you reach a certain level with various incidents ticking off boxes on the stress track, you would have certain consequences. So for instance, you might have a stress track of 10 spaces, with the first one being bandit attacks on the village, to the 10th one being the bandit king tries to usurp the prince of the country and seize power. And you could have various different consequences along the way that would occur to that final finale. And that's a very interesting idea, which I think could be quite a good way of keeping track of plot, and would be capable of like writing down on your normal index card or a very small sort of area rather than having reams of notes. I'm not sure how entirely it'd work for plots which are twisty and turny and go lots of different ways, but I certainly think it's worth having a further look at. Chapter 21 talks about how treasure can be abstracted or given a bit more crunch if you require it for your game. And again, it's great to have more options. Chapter 22 is called Other Worlds and Other Realities, and this discusses the cosmology of your world and planes of existence. And this is a very small chapter that mainly consists of lots of random tables for creating different planes. And in my mind, it only really gives a suggestion of a multiverse. It's a good starter, but it's not really much more. I certainly think if you were inexperienced or were less certain of yourselves, you wouldn't come up with a particularly interesting campaign cosmology using the tables in this chapter. However, if you already have some good ideas or you're more comfortable with expanding on this stuff, then it's certainly a good starting off point. Chapters 24 and 25 deal with Anglerre and the Hinterkingdoms, the two campaign settings offered in this book. Anglerre is a setting based on the comics that appeared over 5 issues of the Starblazer comic line, and whose artwork decorates the pages of this book. And it's a sword and sorcery setting, a fairly small chapter on it, but I certainly think it'll be enough to get you up and running, and then you can expand on it yourself. The Hinterkingdoms are a high fantasy setting that contains far more of your usual elves, dwarves, fantasy races, etc. And it's a fairly standard setting, but there are some flavourful stunts in there and some interesting aspects. Also, the idea of the old gods who were supplanted by the celestial powers during the First Alliance is a very interesting idea, and that harkens back to the mythic cycle of the Titans and the gods, or similar entities that features in a lot of real-world mythology. And thus it has a certain gravitas, or a certain realistic feel to it, although I'm not sure if realistic's the right word. Now, Chapter 26 is a bestiary, and this is just a massive collection of monsters and creatures that covers a lot of the book. And there's a little bit of information at the start on balancing encounters, which is fairly useful, but there's little ecology detail on the monsters. However, I will say that because of the way Fate works, the aspects on each monster and the stunts do give you a fairly good idea of what that creature is all about. And so I don't see this being quite as much of a problem as it might be in a bestiary for another game system. So what's my final verdict on the Legends of Anglerre? Well, the book is certainly very comprehensive, and there's material inside to allow you to run almost any fantasy subtype or genre using Fate. I don't think I'd attempt to run it all using the options in the book as a whole, since I think the level of additional detail in the book and the additional complication would detract from the simplicity of the Fate system, which in my opinion is one of its major strengths. However, as a grab bag of ideas and different rules, along with some good GM advice, some very good GM advice, I'd certainly recommend it. If you plan on running a fantasy campaign with Fate, it's at least worth a look. Certainly in the form of the PDF, even if you're not planning on buying the hard copy. The hard copy itself is available for £34.99 in the UK, which is probably about $56, $57 according to the current Google currency translator, which isn't cheap at all, to be perfectly honest. However, as said earlier, it is a very handsome, very thick book, and you do get an awful lot of bang for your buck. So I'd certainly recommend that if you're at all interested in running a fantasy game with Fate, you could do far worse than have a look at the Legends of Anglerre. If you've enjoyed this video review, please click on like for this video, and subscribe to my channel below for more updates on my RPG ramblings and further reviews. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have any comments on this. Maybe you have comments on Fate Fantasy or the Legends of Anglerre in particular, or anything else to do with this video. Please also put your comments down below. And until next time, I look forward to reading what you write. Thank you very much for watching this video.